You are 20 years old, and the last thing your father ever carved for you was a small wooden truck, its wheels rounded smooth by his pocketknife, long before either of you understood how much of your life would eventually be spent behind the wheel of a real one. In Leningrad, before the war, your father worked at the Kirov factory, and on Sundays, he taught you to repair engines in a courtyard workshop that always smelled of grease and machine oil. He died 2 winters before the Germans ever reached the city's outskirts, and you kept the small wooden truck on a shelf above your bed, more habit than sentiment, until the autumn of 1941 gave it a weight you never expected an old toy to carry. Your mother, Irina, and your younger sister, Vera, remain in the apartment you grew up in, 3 rooms on the 4th floor of a building near the Neva River, and the small wooden truck rides in your coat pocket now, every single day, because somewhere in the desperate logic of a besieged city, you have decided it will help you bring food back to them if you simply keep it close enough. Before the siege, your life is built from small, ordinary certainties. You work as a driver for a state trucking cooperative, hauling machine parts between factories, and you are good enough at engine repair that other drivers bring you their trucks before they bring them to an official mechanic. Your closest friend, Alexei, drives the route beside yours and has an inexhaustible collection of jokes about factory foremen that somehow never repeat themselves. There is Elena, a telephone operator you met at a factory dance, whose laugh you have been chasing for the better part of a year without quite working up the courage to ask her anything more serious than whether she is free on Sunday. Leningrad, in those final months of peace, still carries the particular energy of a city proud of itself. The Hermitage crowded with visitors on weekends, the Kirov Theater selling out performances weeks in advance, factory workers like yourself gathering at dances that run late into summer evenings when the sun barely sets at all this far north. You allow yourself, that final summer, to imagine an entirely unremarkable future. A wife, an apartment slightly larger than the one you share with your mother, perhaps eventually a truck of your own rather than one assigned by the cooperative. None of it feels like anything worth treasuring specifically until the autumn takes the option away entirely. In September 1941, German forces complete the encirclement of Leningrad, cutting the city off from all reliable overland supply. And the siege that follows becomes, within weeks, a catastrophe of starvation and cold that the history of the war has rarely equaled. Ration allowances shrink to amounts that barely sustain a child, let alone a grown adult performing physical labor, and by December, people collapse in the streets from hunger with a regularity that stops shocking anyone, which frightens you more than the shock itself ever did. The one thing standing between Leningrad and complete starvation is Lake Ladoga, a vast body of water east of the city that, once frozen thick enough in winter, becomes the only route capable of carrying supplies into the besieged city and evacuating civilians out of it. Soviet authorities call it the Military Highway Number 101, though every driver and soldier who crosses it comes to know it by a different name entirely. The Road of Life, 30 kilometers of exposed ice under constant threat of German artillery, aircraft, and the ice itself, which can crack open beneath a fully loaded truck with almost no warning at all. You are assigned to a transport unit operating the ice road in November 1941, driving trucks loaded with flour and grain toward the city and returning with evacuees, most of them children and the severely weakened, packed as tightly as the cargo bed allows without the added weight risking the ice beneath your wheels. Your unit commander, Sergeant Orlov, a heavy-set man in his 40s who worked as a harbor pilot before the war, teaches you the specific superstitious science of reading ice thickness by sound, color, and the particular groan a frozen lake makes when it is, deciding whether to hold. The first weeks on the ice road introduce you to a specific kind of fear that driving through open combat never quite prepares a person for, because the danger here is patient and mostly invisible. arriving without the courtesy of a warning shot. German aircraft strafe the road regularly, forcing convoys to space vehicles far enough apart that a single strike cannot destroy an entire line of trucks at once, and long-range artillery occasionally finds the range despite the distance, throwing up sudden columns of ice and water that leave drivers uncertain whether the crater ahead is passable or simply the last visible marker before open water. You learn to drive with your door slightly open in case the ice gives way beneath you, a habit every experienced driver adopts within their first month, since a closed door has drowned more men than German shells ever managed to along this particular stretch of frozen lake. Orlov teaches you other things too, less about survival than about the specific discipline the road demands of every driver crossing it. Never follow the exact tracks of the truck ahead, since repeated wait on the same weakened point invites exactly the kind of failure the road is famous for. Keep your speed steady rather than fast, since ice responds to the rhythm of pressure more than the raw force of it. A lesson that sounds almost philosophical the way Orlov explains it, sitting on an overturned crate during a supply halt, speaking as though the lake itself were a living thing capable of being reasoned with under the correct circumstances. Alexei drives the truck ahead of yours on most convoys, and the two of you develop a private ritual of flashing headlights twice at checkpoints simply to confirm, without needing to stop and speak, that the other has survived another crossing intact. Elena, meanwhile, works a telephone exchange that occasionally routes messages between transport units and city authorities, and on the rare nights your convoy schedules overlap with her shift, you manage brief, precious conversations through crackling wires that feel, in the specific starvation of that terrible winter, more sustaining than the actual food you are hauling across the ice. You write to her more than you speak to her directly. Brief notes pass through other drivers, because a besieged city teaches people to treasure whatever connection survives the war's constant interruptions, however fragmented that connection has become. She once tells you, in a note passed through a fellow driver during the worst week of that first winter, that hearing your voice crackle briefly through a shared telephone line felt more like proof the city was still alive than any official announcement broadcast over the public radio ever managed to in January 1942. During one of the coldest weeks the city experiences throughout the entire siege, your convoy is ordered to evacuate a group of children from an orphanage whose building has been damaged by shelling, along with the elderly and severely malnourished patients from a nearby hospital ward. The children are thin in a way that unsettles you more than any battlefield wound you will later witness, their eyes too large for faces that have lost the fat that normally rounds a child's cheeks, and several of them have to be carried rather than walked to the trucks, too weak to manage the short distance from the damaged orphanage building on their own strength. A young nurse accompanying the group moves between children with a calm, exhausted efficiency that suggests she has performed this exact task more times than any person should reasonably have to. Checking pulses, adjusting blankets, speaking softly to the ones frightened enough to cry, despite having little strength left for crying properly. A small girl no older than 6 or 7 is placed in your truck's cab beside you because she is too weak to sit upright unsupported in the open cargo bed with the others. She does not speak during the first hour of the crossing, staring instead at the small wooden truck riding in your coat pocket where it has slipped slightly into view, until finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, she asks whether it is a toy. You take it out and place it in her small, freezing hands, telling her it was carved by your own father, that it survived one war already inside a family that intends for it to survive this one as well. She holds it the rest of the crossing without saying anything further, though something in her expression for the first time since she boarded your truck resembles something close to a child again, rather than simply a small, exhausted survivor. Midway across the lake that same night, the truck ahead of yours, driven by a young soldier named Fedorov who joined your unit only weeks earlier, strikes a section of ice weakened by a recent artillery strike nobody has yet marked or reported. You watch, from a distance too far to prevent anything, as the truck's rear wheels break through first, the vehicle tilting at an angle that gives the men still aboard only seconds to scramble free before the ice gives way completely beneath the engine's weight. Sergeant Orlov organizes a rescue effort immediately. Ropes and boards passed forward along the stalled convoy, and between the combined effort of a dozen soldiers working in freezing darkness, everyone aboard Fedorov's truck is pulled from the water alive, though 2 of the evacuated patients succumb to the cold within hours, despite blankets and immediate attention. Fedorov himself sits shaking uncontrollably beside the road for nearly 20 minutes before Orlov physically lifts him back into a working vehicle, telling him quietly that a driver who stops moving on this particular road eventually stops entirely, in every sense the sentence can carry. Fedorov drives again the following night, hands still visibly unsteady on the wheel, though he completes the crossing without incident. And Orlov tells you afterward, privately, that the second crossing after a near drowning matters more than the first ever could, since it is the second crossing that determines whether a man remains useful to the road or becomes a liability the unit can no longer risk assigning. The girl beside you sleeps for the remainder of that crossing, the small wooden truck still held tightly in one fist even in sleep. And when your convoy finally reaches the eastern shore and the evacuation processing point beyond it, medical staff lift her gently from the cab while you stand nearby, uncertain for a strange, suspended moment, whether you are permitted to say goodbye to a child you met only hours earlier under circumstances neither of you chose. She does not let go of the wooden truck as they carry her toward a waiting train bound for the Soviet interior, and you decide, watching her disappear into the crowd of similarly thin, silent children being processed alongside her, that some objects are worth losing if losing them means a person survives to hold something at all. The siege continues for months beyond that single crossing, stretching eventually toward 900 days of encirclement before Soviet forces finally break the blockade in January 1944. You continue driving the ice road through 2 more brutal winters, watching the specific rhythms of the road of life evolve as engineers reinforce weak sections. Anti-aircraft positions grow more numerous along its length, and the sheer volume of supplies moving across the lake gradually increases even as German attempts to interdict the route continue relentlessly. Alexei survives the entire siege beside you, though a piece of shrapnel costs him partial use of his left hand during the second winter, an injury he treats with the same inexhaustible humor he brought to factory foreman jokes before the war ever reached either of you. Elena survives as well, thinner by the war's end than either of you can fully reconcile with the woman you first met laughing at a factory dance, though her laugh, when it finally returns fully sometime after the blockade breaks, sounds enough like its old self that you allow yourself, for the first time in years, to imagine a future extending meaningfully beyond the war's own ending. The ice road itself becomes, over those 2 additional winters, a strange kind of home despite everything it costs. A community of drivers and mechanics and anti-aircraft crews who develop their own private vocabulary of jokes, superstitions, and small rituals that outsiders would find impossible to fully understand. You learn to recognize other drivers by the particular sound of their engines before headlights ever confirm their identity. A skill Orlov insists separates a true ice road driver from someone merely passing through the assignment temporarily. Your mother and sister survive the siege as well, though barely. Vera's growth visibly stunted by years of malnutrition in ways that only become fully apparent once ordinary food again becomes available to her developing body. Sergeant Orlov does not survive to see the blockade's end, killed during an artillery strike on the ice road during its final winter of operation, and you carry, for the rest of your own life, the particular weight of a mentor who taught you precisely how to read ice thickness by sound and color but who could not. In the end, read the specific piece of ice that finally claimed him. You marry Elena in the autumn following the siege's end, in a Leningrad still scarred by shelling and slowly, painfully rebuilding itself. The wedding modest by any ordinary peacetime standard but overwhelming to both of you regardless, since simply having survived long enough to hold it at all feels like the more remarkable achievement compared to anything the ceremony itself could offer her. And though you rarely discuss the war directly in the decades that follow, you keep a single photograph from that period, a group of thin, exhausted drivers standing beside their trucks on the ice. That hangs in your home for the rest of your life without ever fully needing an explanation for visitors who ask about it. You are 76 when a letter arrives from a woman in Novosibirsk, now a grandmother herself, who explains that she was evacuated as a small child across Lake Ladoga during the terrible winter of 1942, and that she has spent decades searching for the young driver who once gave her a small wooden toy truck during that crossing, an object she kept for the rest of her life and has now passed to her own grandchildren along with the story attached to it. Her letter describes details you had long assumed only you still remembered, the specific cold of that particular night, the sound the ice made beneath the tires, a fragment of a song one of the other evacuated children hummed quietly somewhere behind her in the cargo bed, details that arrive now, decades later, with the strange, disorienting force of a memory suddenly confirmed as real by someone other than yourself. She does not know your name, only the general details of that particular convoy, and a description vague enough that finding you at all required considerable persistence and no small amount of fortune. You write back, confirming what she already suspected, and enclose a single photograph of yourself as a young man standing beside a truck on the ice, taken the same winter you gave a small girl the only thing you had left of your own father to offer her. When your own grandchildren ask, years later, what the road of life actually felt like to drive, you tell them it felt like carrying an entire city's future across ice thin enough to hear it thinking about breaking beneath you, and that the specific weight of that responsibility never fully leaves a person's hands. Even decades after the ice itself has long since returned each winter and thawed again every following spring, indifferent, the way ice always eventually is, to everything it was once asked to carry.